There will come a time when people will go crazy, and when a sane person comes along, they will attack him, saying, "You are crazy." Have you ever stopped to think why, at certain times, it seems that an entire society loses its sense of reality? Why individuals who would normally be rational begin to accept irrational ideas across the board? This intriguing and dangerous phenomenon, which has challenged philosophers and historians for centuries, is called collective psychosis. Gustave Le Bon, a renowned 20th century psychologist, said, "The masses never thirst for truth. They turn away from evidence that doesn't suit their tastes, preferring to deify error if it seduces them. Whoever provides them with illusions easily becomes their master. Whoever tries to destroy their illusions invariably becomes their victim." This powerful observation leads us to reflect on how an entire society can be consumed by madness. Now, if I were to ask you what the greatest threats to civilization are, you might think of natural disasters, pandemics, or wars. But what if I told you that for Carl Jung, the greatest danger is not out there, but inside the human mind? Jung believed that our inability to face the inner forces of the psyche is the most serious threat to civilization. He described it as a struggle against our own nature. Have you ever heard the Latin proverb, "Homo homini lupus est"? Man is the wolf of man? This phrase perfectly sums up what Jung meant. This wolfish nature is especially evident in the darkest moments of history, when the irrational becomes the rule rather than the exception. Jung called this phenomenon a psychic epidemic. In The Symbolic Life, he wrote, "It is not famine, nor earthquakes, nor microbes, nor cancer, but man who is the greatest danger to man, for the simple reason that there is no adequate protection against psychic epidemics, which are infinitely more devastating than the worst natural catastrophes." But what exactly is a collective psychosis? It's like an epidemic of madness that causes an entire society to lose touch with reality and plunge into delusions. It may seem a long way off, but history is full of disturbing examples. Think of the witch hunts that took place in Europe and America between the 15th and 17th centuries. Thousands of people, mainly women, were persecuted and killed, not for real crimes, but because they had become scapegoats for a society gripped by fear and panic. In the book Satan's Delusion, Francis Hill describes that in some Swiss villages, there were hardly any women left alive when the frenzy finally ended. Another striking example is the totalitarianism of the 20th century. While fear prepares the ground for mind, entire nations embraced ideologies that today seem clearly destructive and irrational. Yet at the time, millions of people were seduced by these ideas, falling under their collective spell. The results of a collective psychosis are absolutely devastating. Jung studied these phenomena in depth and observed that when a society succumbs to madness, its members suffer a moral and spiritual regression. They become more irrational, driven by emotions and devoid of responsibility. Crimes that an individual would never commit alone are now committed in groups without any sign of remorse. The most frightening thing is that just as a person in a state of psychosis cannot recognize their own delusions, a society gripped by a collective psychosis is incapable of perceiving its own insanity. There is no external point of view that allows individuals in this condition to see the extent of the problem. But what drives a society into this state of collective madness? To understand this, we first need to analyze the causes of psychosis in an individual. Although physical trauma or substance use can be triggers, the focus here is on the psychological factors that trigger this kind of breakdown. The most common trigger for a psychosis is an overload of negative emotions, such as fear or anxiety, which plunges the individual into a state of panic. Now imagine this panic spreading through an entire population like a virus. When we are in this state of panic, we desperately seek relief. Some people confront the source of their anxiety directly, but others end up succumbing to a psychotic breakdown as a way of escaping the emotional pain. Contrary to what many people believe, a psychotic break is not simply a plunge into chaos, but an attempt to reorganize a person's experience. It combines fact and fiction, reality and delusion, in a way that temporarily relieves feelings of panic. It is a coping mechanism, albeit a deeply dysfunctional and maladaptive one. Silvano Arrietty, one of the 20th century's leading authorities on schizophrenia, described the psychogenic stages that lead to the development of madness. The first is the panic phase, in which the individual begins to perceive the world differently. They feel frightened, confused, and unable to explain the strange experiences they are having. Next comes what Arietti calls the psychotic insight phase. In this stage, the individual begins to organize their perceptions and creates a pathological vision of reality. This allows them to make sense of the abnormal experiences they are facing. Arietti uses the term insight because the person finally finds meaning in their experiences. But it is considered psychotic because this meaning is rooted in delusions and not in a realistic understanding of the situation. In essence, delusions offer the panicked individual a way out of the flood of negative emotions, but this comes at the cost of losing touch with reality. As Silvano Arietti explains, a psychotic breakdown is actually an abnormal way of dealing with extreme states of anxiety. Now expand that to the level of an entire society. If a wave of negative emotions can drive a vulnerable individual into a psychotic breakdown, a collective psychosis can arise when a vulnerable population is driven to panic by threats, whether real, imagined, or fabricated. And here's something important. The delusions of a society can take different forms, and collective madness can manifest itself in different ways. The form that a collective psychosis takes will depend on the historical and cultural context of the society affected. In modern times, one of the most dangerous manifestations of collective psychosis is totalitarianism. Historian Arthur Versluis defines totalitarianism as the modern phenomenon in which centralized state power becomes absolute, accompanied by the destruction of individual and human rights. In totalitarian regimes, society is divided into two main groups, the rulers and the ruled. Both undergo profoundly pathological transformations. The rulers are elevated to an almost divine status as if they were infallible. However, this is in stark contrast to human nature, which is imperfect and easily corrupted by power. This idealization creates authoritarian leaders who are disconnected from reality. On the other hand, the masses are reduced to a state of total dependence on these rulers. Psychologically, this puts them in a regressive, almost infantile position, where they behave like passive subjects, unable to act or think for themselves. Hannah Arendt, one of the leading scholars of totalitarianism in the 20th century, described this phenomenon as an attempt to transform human nature itself. However, this transformation does not result in a utopia, but in a society where healthy minds become sick. Under totalitarianism, social change is constructed and maintained on the basis of delusions, destroying shared reality. An essential element for the success of totalitarianism is menticide, or murder of the mind. Psychiatrist Joost Meerloo, in his book The Rape of the Mind, described menticide as an organized system of psychological manipulation that eliminates people's ability to think independently. Through this process, the ruling class manages to imprint its own opportunistic thoughts on the minds of the masses, which it plans to control and eventually destroy. He explained that the technique involves the use of fear combined with propaganda to subjugate the population. Now let's understand how this process of menticide unfolds. The process begins by spreading fear, putting the population in a state of panic that makes them receptive to delusional beliefs. A particularly effective technique for this is the use of so-called terror waves. In this method, periods of intense alarm are alternated with moments of calm. However, each period of calm is followed by a new outbreak of even more intense fear, creating a cycle that perpetuates itself. Joost Meerloo explains how this method affects people psychologically. Each new wave of terror becomes more effective because people are still emotionally shaken by the previous experience. This causes the morality of the population to gradually decline, while the psychological effects of the propaganda campaigns intensify. The public, already weakened, becomes increasingly susceptible to manipulation. While fear prepares the ground for menticide, propaganda plays a crucial role in the process. Think, for example, of how sensationalist and conflicting headlines on social media amplify crises, leaving you anxious and unable to distinguish what is true or false. This deliberate confusion prevents people from reasoning clearly, further weakening their minds. The constant bombardment of exaggerated information, such as catastrophic predictions or unfounded accusations, creates a state of collective panic in which logic is replaced by emotional reactions. Contradictory reports and deliberately confusing information are effective tools in this process. As Joost Meerloo observed, logic can be confronted with logic, but illogic confuses those who try to think clearly. This confusion not only paralyzes rational thinking, but also increases the masses' dependence on leaders, who present themselves as the only ones capable of providing answers. In other words, confusion makes the population even more vulnerable to the delusions of totalitarianism. The big lie and the constant repetition of absurdities have a greater emotional impact than logical and rational arguments. While people are still trying to find a logical rebuttal to the first lie, the totalitarians are already launching another one, keeping the population constantly off balance. In the modern world, the means to manipulate society towards the psychosis of totalitarianism have never been more powerful. With social networks, algorithms, and digital technologies, propaganda and fear can be spread on a global scale in a matter of seconds, reaching millions of people simultaneously. Think of viral disinformation campaigns, such as the manipulation of elections or boycott movements based on fake news. This technology not only amplifies the reach, but also adjusts specific messages to exploit the insecurities and emotions of each individual, making manipulation more effective than ever. In addition, dependence on these technologies, combined with a lack of spaces for reflection and genuine dialogue, makes people even more vulnerable. The speed and repetition of information limits the masses' ability to process events critically, leaving them more susceptible to large-scale manipulation and psychological control. Merleau has brilliantly summarized the dangers of this modernity. As has been pointed out, modern technology teaches people to passively accept the world that is before their eyes. There is no more time set aside to withdraw and reflect. Technology seduces him, involving him in an incessant cycle of stimuli without pause, meditation, reflection, or dialogue. The senses are constantly overloaded, making it difficult to find moments of silence or introspection. Man thus stops questioning the world around him because the screens already offer him ready-made, molded, and simplified answers. This state of passivity weakens the capacity for critical thinking and further deepens dependence on technology. Social isolation is a powerful tool used to facilitate totalitarian control. Both Hannah Arendt and Joost Meerloo identified isolation as one of the key factors in the success of totalitarianism. Remember the recent lockdown periods when normal social interactions were drastically reduced. For many, the increased consumption of alarmist news and the isolation of alternative viewpoints contributed to a sense of fear and dependence on central authorities. When people are deprived of normal interactions with friends, family, and colleagues, they become much more vulnerable to imposed delusions, and this is for several reasons. Firstly, isolation eliminates contact with positive examples, which could serve as a corrective force. Not everyone succumbs to the propaganda and manipulations of the ruling elite. Those who see through the lies have the power to help others escape the mental onslaught. However, when isolation is imposed, the influence of these individuals decreases dramatically. In addition, isolation facilitates mental conditioning. Like other species, human beings are more easily conditioned to new patterns of thought and behavior when they are isolated. Merleau relates this to the experiments of physiologist Ivan Pavlov, who discovered that conditioned reflexes are more easily developed in quiet environments without disturbing external stimuli. Animal trainers know this dynamic well. Isolation, combined with patient repetition of stimuli, is essential for taming wild creatures. Totalitarians apply this same rule, knowing that they can condition their political victims more effectively when they keep them isolated, confused, and subjected to continuous waves of terror. A population under attack by menticide is driven into a state of hopelessness and vulnerability. The incessant flow of propaganda turns previously rational minds into stages for irrational forces, where chaos takes over both the external and internal worlds. In this scenario, the masses desperately yearn for a return to order. It is at this moment of fragility that future totalitarians take their decisive step. They offer a solution, a way back to order, but at a very high price. To accept this way out, the masses must give up their freedom and hand over total control of their lives to the ruling elite. This means renouncing self-sufficiency and individual responsibility, becoming submissive and obedient subjects. In other words, they must descend into the illusions of totalitarian psychosis. Merleau describes this descent impressively. The totalitarian systems of the 20th century represent a form of collective psychosis. In this state, whether through a gradual or sudden transformation, reason and human decency cease to exist. What remains is a constant atmosphere of terror and the projection of an imaginary enemy that has infiltrated our midst. Society then begins to turn against itself, incited by the dominant authorities who manipulate fear and paranoia to maintain absolute control. The order promised by a totalitarian regime is actually a pathological order. By imposing rigid conformity and demanding blind obedience, totalitarianism stifles the spontaneity that is the source of many of life's joys and destroys the creativity that drives society's progress. Under such absolute control, whether exercised by scientists, doctors, politicians, bureaucrats, or dictators, the inevitable result is stagnation, destruction, and often mass death. So perhaps the most urgent question we face is, how do we avoid totalitarianism? And if a society has already been driven into the early stages of this collective psychosis, is there any hope of reversing it? Although the prognosis of collective madness is uncertain, there are steps that can be taken to help restore sanity. This task requires a broad and diverse approach, involving the efforts of many different people. Just as the mental attack is multifaceted, so must the counteroffensive be. For those who wish to contribute to the healing of an insane world, the first step is to bring order to one's own mind and to live in a way that inspires others to do the same. Carl Jung emphasized the importance of the redeeming personality in times like these. He pointed out that our era cries out for individuals who are able to free themselves from the grip of collective psychosis, who save at least their own soul and in doing so become a beacon of hope. These people proclaim through their actions, here is at least one human being who has managed to break free from the fatal identification with the group psyche. Assuming that someone manages to live free from the grip of collective psychosis, there are additional steps that can be taken to combat the advance of totalitarianism and help restore collective sanity. The first step is to spread information that counters the dominant propaganda. Truth has greater power than fiction, and the falsehoods propagated by aspiring totalitarian rulers depend largely on censoring the free flow of information. The more widely the truth is disseminated, the greater the chance of neutralizing manipulation. Another effective tactic is the use of humor and ridicule to delegitimize the ruling elite. Joost Meerloo suggests that we should treat demagogues and dictators with the weapon of ridicule. He argues that demagogues are generally incapable of dealing with humor, and when they are ridiculed, they begin to crumble. This kind of approach destabilizes the authority they try to project, undermining their power over the masses. Václav Havel, a political dissident under the Soviet communist regime and later president of Czechoslovakia, recommended building parallel structures as a fundamental tactic. A parallel structure is any form of organization, business, institution, technology, or creative enterprise that physically exists within a totalitarian society, but morally operates outside of it. In communist Czechoslovakia, Havel observed that these structures were more effective in combating totalitarianism than political action itself. As enough parallel structures are created, a parallel society spontaneously emerges, an enclave of freedom and sanity that offers a functional alternative to the oppressive system. This parallel society not only challenges the totalitarian regime, but also plants the seeds of a freer and fairer future. Václav Havel, in his book The Power of the Weak, defines parallel structures as a space where a different life can be lived, a life in harmony with its own goals, which is organized according to these values. These structures represent the first steps of a society seeking to free itself from the self-sustaining mechanisms of totalitarianism, radically detaching itself from the oppressive system. They are a form of practical and moral resistance that offers a real alternative within the regime itself. However, to prevent the world from falling completely into the madness of totalitarianism, action is needed from as many people as possible. Just as totalitarian elites do not remain inactive, but deliberately act to consolidate their power, an active and coordinated effort is also needed to move society back onto the path of freedom. This is a challenging task, especially in a world that indulges in totalitarian illusions. However, as Thomas Paine stated during another dark period in history, tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. But, as Paine also pointed out, the more difficult the conflict, the more glorious the victory. The struggle against totalitarianism is not just physical or political, it is, above all, psychological. Totalitarian elites understand this perfectly, which is why they invest so much in controlling the narrative and manipulating emotions. To resist, it is crucial that we become aware of our own psychological vulnerabilities and work to strengthen our minds against these manipulations. An essential way to do this is through education, both formal and self-education. We must, Cultivate critical thinking skills, questioning seemingly unquestionable narratives. Learn to challenge authority, especially when it tries to silence or repress freedom of thought. Recognize propaganda and manipulation, understanding the methods used to distort the truth and shape behavior. These actions not only make us more resistant to manipulation, but also help to create a more informed society, capable of confronting the threats of totalitarianism and preserving freedom. This includes developing the ability to recognize logical fallacies, check facts carefully, and maintain a healthy skepticism, while avoiding falling into the trap of paranoia. Furthermore, a fundamental aspect of resisting totalitarianism is preserving our humanity and connections with others. Totalitarian systems thrive on dehumanization and isolation, and by cultivating genuine relationships, practicing empathy, and refusing to see others as mere abstractions or enemies, we resist the totalitarian mindset at its root. We also need to be vigilant about protecting our privacy and personal autonomy. As technology advances, the tools to monitor and control populations become increasingly sophisticated. Being conscious of our digital activities, supporting the use of privacy-respecting technologies, and resisting the exchange of privacy for convenience are important steps in limiting the reach of possible totalitarian regimes. In short, resisting totalitarianism requires a combination of practical skills, such as critical thinking and skepticism, and essential human practices, such as empathy and preserving social connections. In addition, it is essential to protect the private sphere, ensuring that our autonomy and freedom are not sacrificed in the name of a false sense of security or practicality. These small acts are pillars of resistance that, together, can preserve freedom in a world that is increasingly vulnerable to authoritarian control. It is also essential to support and protect freedom of expression and the press, as these are often the first victims of a totalitarian takeover. Even if we don't agree with what is being said, it is essential to defend the right to say it. Freedom of expression is the foundation of a free society, and without it, open debate and critical thinking are stifled. This includes supporting independent journalism and alternative media that challenge official narratives and offer different perspectives. In addition, it is crucial to remain vigilant against the gradual advance of authoritarianism. Totalitarianism rarely takes hold suddenly. It creeps in little by little, with each small concession making the next step more acceptable. This is why we must be willing to draw non-negotiable lines and say no more to any encroachment on our freedoms, even when these encroachments are presented as measures for our own good. It is important to recognize that art and culture play a crucial role in this struggle for freedom. Totalitarian regimes often try to control art and suppress creativity because they understand its power to inspire, unite, and awaken consciences. By creating and supporting artistic manifestations that celebrate freedom, individuality, and human dignity, we keep the flame of freedom alive, even in the darkest times. The fight against the collective psychosis of totalitarianism is one of the most important battles of our time. This battle is not only fought in the halls of power or on the streets, but in the minds and hearts of every individual. The road is arduous, and the outcome is never guaranteed. But as long as there are people who value freedom, who think critically, and who maintain their humanity in the face of dehumanizing forces, there is hope. As Albert Camus said, the only way to deal with an unfree world is to become absolutely free, so that your very existence is an act of rebellion. So let's commit ourselves to this rebellion for freedom. Let us be the beacon of sanity and courage in a world that seems increasingly plunged into chaos. The choice is before us. Succumb to the psychosis of totalitarianism or stand up for freedom, creativity, and human dignity. May we choose to be the resistance, because the future of our humanity depends on it. Otherwise, we could end up losing ourselves in this psychosis and becoming cruel people, regardless of how good we are. If you want to know why these good people become cruel, click on the video on the screen and watch it now.